Well, I think if you were to think of this virus as a Marvel comic supervillain, I think you would think of it as having the superpowers of invisibility, stealth, and being able to travel literally supersonic speeds.
In 2020, a virus called SARS-CoV-2 and its partner in crime, Covid-19, take on the world.
COVID-19 has proven to be a very formidable opponent.
It tricks you into thinking it's the flu and then kills you at random.
We really don't know why certain people die and other people don't even develop symptoms.
Attempting to bankrupt the global economy, COVID-19 manages to turn the world against each other.
COVID-19 is a bully, and it's attacking all the human race.
And as the millions of infections and deaths keep climbing, how do we stop it?
Government or scientists or doctor alone cannot get this done. You really need to mobilize every citizen on this planet. We have to work together.
This is COVID versus the world. Shanghai, January 5th, 2020. Professor Zheng Yongchun uploads the details of a new virus to global website GenBank. It's called Wuhan HU1.
肯定不是一个普通的流感，更不是其他的一个毒性比较弱的一个病原体引起的一个普通感冒。
Within a week, Chang and his colleague Professor Edward Holmes translate their findings in English and release it to a more prominent scientific discussion forum, virological.org.
所以说，我想1月11号，大致我们把这个病毒的基因组全序列释放以后，应该讲引起了国际上病毒学家高度的关注，甚至也有个别的人已经猜到这个病毒致病性有可能不弱于 SARS 或者说 MERS。中国国内的以及国际上的病毒学家都会认识到，这个病是真的是狼来。
2 weeks later, the big bad wolf would become globally known as SARS-CoV-2 and would go on to become one of the most destructive viruses in the 21st century.
Viruses are enigmatic creatures. When I'm teaching them to students, they are often asking me the question, are they alive or are they not? And I think this question has been best answered quite a few years ago by a Nobel Prize-winning scientist called Peter Medawar, who discovered transplantation antigens. And he said that for him, a virus was a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein.
And when it comes to bad news, SARS-CoV-2, the virus behind the disease COVID-19, is not the baddest virus on the planet. That accolade goes to the Marburg and Ebola viruses, whose fatality rates have reached as high as 80%. SARS-CoV-2's plan for the world is different. Keeping a low fatality rate of between 1 and 2%, it goes for mass infection, without telling you.
I think it's important to understand that the most deadly viruses are not necessarily the biggest threats to public health. If you think about the population of a country like the UK, 60 million people, something like that, 1% of them, if they were all to become infected, is over 500,000 people. And that's why people suddenly started to realize we had a very, very dangerous virus on our hands. Not one that was like Ebola and killed you every time you caught it, but one which spread like wildfire and killed a decent fraction of people, and that's a really scary thing, and that's what we have to watch out for.
SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus. When seen under the electron microscope, they give the appearance of a crown, or corona in Latin. But you don't have to be royalty to have caught one before. In fact, if you've caught a cold, you've had a coronavirus already.
So we can almost be certain that everybody on Earth, if you grow until, once you pass your teenage, most likely you have been hit with at least one of the 4 seasonal crops once in your lifetime. So the name of these are OC43, 229E, Na63 and HKU1. I mean, for general public, you don't hear them because they're not serious pathogens, right?
But if the coronavirus comes with an animal backstory, it becomes very serious indeed. Scientists have known for a long time that behind every successful virus, there is a bat in there somewhere.
So for COVID-19, within 5 days of discovering the human virus, they discover a bat virus. And then by sequence the whole genetic code, they identified to say the bat virus is 96% identical to the human virus. So our study demonstrated that bats have gone through 65 million years of evolution to adapt to their flight capability. During that time, they have to evolve a very balanced defense and tolerance mechanism. They don't suffer heart disease, less prone to cancer, they don't have diabetes, they don't have autoimmune disease, and the list goes on.
In other words, bats have created an almost perfect immune system. They carry multiple diseases, but never get sick. It's when they unintentionally pass a virus on to humans that things turn deadly. And they do this via a whole range of unwitting virus traffickers. Animals.
What you gonna do when it come for you? Bag of tricks, now watch me move. What you gonna do when it come for you? Bag of tricks, now watch me move.
And in this planet, human-animal interaction is getting closer and closer. Whether you're visiting zoo or you have pet or you have a farm, right? You can source the wildlife anywhere in the world, legally or illegally. For COVID-19, there are many different theories. I still believe there's an intermediate animal involved, but whether that animal is a pangolin or another mammal, we scientists are still working on that.
SARS-CoV-2 is just one of about 5,000 viruses that humans have discovered so far. The rest seem to be waiting in the wings.
根据国际上一些科学家的分析和判断，如果一种细胞生物能携带一种病毒的话，就是光是我们常常看到的，像蜱啊、蚊子啊这些节肢动物携带的病毒，就可能有100多万种。
Within 12 weeks of its arrival, COVID races out of the blocks, and the cat-and-mouse chase with scientists begins. It hijacks a cruise ship in Japan, a church in South Korea, and then heads to Iran and Italy, leaving behind little clues for scientists along the way. One of them is that while young, healthy people seem to be able to withstand the virus, it's the old and not so healthy that are vulnerable. All of a sudden, COVID-19 has a smorgasbord of humans to choose from.
If you think about it, we are all living longer. We are living with more chronic illnesses. We are eating too much. We are growing too big. We have an epidemic of obesity, hypertension, diabetes.
At best, victims get a fever and a cough. At worst, pneumonia. But it's the havoc that COVID-19 is causing elsewhere in the body that really worries scientists.
We do know that something called a cytokine storm is generated in response to virus-infected cells, which causes liquids to flood into the lungs and give a pneumonia, which is extremely dangerous. But we also know there are other symptoms in other tissues that aren't caused by that at all. They're caused by, as yet, unidentified mechanisms. So really importantly, there's coagulation of the blood going on in multiple tissues. We see it in heart tissues, we see it in the gut, we see it in the kidneys, and we get organ failure. We can have clots in the brain that give rise to strokes.
In order to stop a virus, you have to deny its means of survival.
Yeah, I mean, viruses are parasites, right? So they could not live by themselves. They have to live within a living cell. That cell can be a bacteria, can be a human, can be a bat, can be a pangolin.
If SARS-CoV-2 cannot find a human or an animal or cell to live in, it will die.
If you think about it, it is a respiratory virus. It transmits by droplets. When I speak, when I cough, when I sneeze, I pass the virus over, which means we humans are responsible for the transmission of the virus. The virus is useless on its own.
Stopping that transmission means keeping humans apart. Exactly how far apart is best seen with the help of laser beams and the extremely sensitive iScope camera.
champion! いわゆるドロップレット、大きな飛沫というのは、1.5 メートルないしは2メートルぐらい放物線を描きながら飛んでいきます。ただボタッと落ちない大きさ重さを持ってないですね、小さい飛沫ですね。まだ水分を持っている飛沫は非常にマイクロレベルですと重力の影響を受けづらいですので、ずっと漂い続けます。それが3メートル4メートルと届くということもございます。
Staying completely away from each other denies the virus another life form in which to continue its own existence. The end. A simple solution, and yet somehow the most difficult to enforce.
Spit happens. Spit happens. Spit happens.
Unless you're China.
从古至今到目前为止，当我们对一个传染病没有针对性的防治措施，没有疫苗，没有针对的药物治疗的时候，我们对付它最好的办法，尤其像这种呼吸道的疾病，特别像 SARS-CoV-2， 它的传播能力这么强，可能隔离是最好的办法。
SARS-CoV-2 spreads so deeply within some countries that it becomes untraceable. This forces governments all over the world to lock their people down in one way or other in order to stop the virus from jumping from human to human. If there's one thing viruses hate, it's a lockdown.
That worked beautifully for Wuhan when they locked down the whole city. And it was a brutal lockdown. No one could get out. They knew that persons transmit to persons, and if you kept them separate, you can't transmit. No ins, no outs, and everyone was locked in their house. And that is infection control 101.
武汉出现这种情况是个不得不的问题。如果我们不封城，恰恰又是中国的春节，又是春运高峰的时候，人们的话呢想去借着这个节假日出去旅游了。如果这个时候我们不加控制的话，这个疫情当时的快速的蔓延和扩散就不仅仅只是武汉地区的事情了，那可能是北京、上海、广州这些大城市受的影响会更大。对于武汉人民来讲是痛苦的，对中国人来讲是痛苦的。
But in more democratic countries where lockdowns are seen as draconian infringements of personal liberty, they've become almost impossible to enforce. And so, the new COVID circle of life is born. Lockdown, relax, reinfection, lockdown, repeat. The result? A tremendous burden on people's mental health.
We know that the consumption of alcohol's gone up dramatically during lockdown. People who are suicidal, self-harming, we know the rates of that have gone up. We know, people's finances being absolutely ripped apart. Education systems across the world have changed. So, I think you've not just got individuals living with uncertainty, you then go out and out to the bigger ecosystem. Everything's uncertain.
Each SARS-CoV-2 virus has a key to access our cells in the form of a spike-like protein. But it can only enter through specific access points, scientifically known as ACE2 receptors. But these ACE2 receptors are not everywhere, They're found most notably in the nose, eyes, lungs, heart, blood vessels, kidneys, liver, and gastrointestinal tract. SARS-CoV-2 hunts down these access points, hijacks the cells, and then starts making more of itself.
Once that particle binds to a new host cell and releases the bad news, the information into that host cell, it takes over the host cell and starts to be used as if it's the host cell's own information to make new virus particles and start the new infection cycle. And in producing lots of new virus particles, they burst apart. So you can see this in the test tube very easily when I grow the virus routinely. We see that the virus can get into a cell and burst it apart with yielding thousands of new virus particles within about 12 hours. It's a really rapid process.
But the SARS-CoV-2 virus has an inbuilt weakness. It's an envelope virus, meaning its outer membrane is made up of lipid, a kind of fat.
So that's, on one hand, is good news to us because by default, a virus have a lipid envelope means they are relatively fragile. So if you have a wash hand with soap, then you basically dissolve the envelope and destroy the virus.
Good old soap and water, a scientifically proven wives' tale. With the first SARS virus back in 2003, the disease peaked at around day 7, and it was here that it was at its most infectious.
It didn't seem to spread until it had already started to go down into the lungs and cause serious disease, and then it would spread from person to person.
With SARS-CoV-2, it seems to be the opposite, and this is hugely problematic, thanks to its viral load.
But in SARS-CoV-2, viral load peaks very quickly, just before the onset of illness by about 3 to 5 days. And thereafter it falls, which means before the onset of symptoms or at the onset of symptoms, the virus was at its maximum capacity to spread and disseminate and pass on to people.
And this is important because it makes it much, much harder to control the way the epidemic spreads, because somebody is spreading the virus without even knowing they're ill.
And to make matters worse, with SARS-CoV-2, you only have to inhale a tiny amount of the virus from an infected person to get sick. The more droplets you inhale, the sicker you get.
Would you move a little close to me?
SARS-CoV-2 has an incredible knack. The amount of virus they have reproducing in the back of the nose is amazing. It's a huge number. In influenza, we talk about droplet transmission. One droplet may be about 10,000, 50,000 copies. In COVID-19, you have billions of copies inside the same droplet. All I need is that 0.001% to succeed, and I've got a new person to spread all around the world.
So, with COVID-19, you are at your most infectious when you have no symptoms and don't know you're sick. That's genius. With social distancing measures proving to be a hit-and-miss affair, humans bring out a century-old hospital favorite, masks.
Masks, we all know that masks actually help prevent infection. It makes perfect logical sense. Mask effectively blocks the transmission of all the droplets that comes out of my mouth or nose and prevents it spreading elsewhere. The mask will hold it back in place. The better the mask is, the better it is apportioned to the face, then the more effective it will be.
But the message about the effectiveness of wearing masks gets hotly debated, despite our parents telling us for decades to cover our mouths when we cough.
We were blindsided that we didn't use masks at the very beginning. We didn't have solid evidence that masks makes a difference. Retrospectively, if all of us could have some form of mask, even handmade with simple towels, it would make a massive difference and we could control the spread throughout the whole world.
As intelligent and angry conversations over masks heat up, Eventually, it is hamsters from Hong Kong that provide us with evidence.
So what they did was they put hamsters in two cages. Those who were infected with the virus in this cage, and those who are uninfected in this other cage. And wind will be stimulated, blowing across, transmitting the virus from one cage to another cage. So in an unprotected situation, wind blowing, the infected hamsters transmitted to the uninfected hamsters at the rate of 66%. They tried to get the hamsters to wear masks, but all the masks didn't fit, or the hamsters protested, or they probably ate up the mask.
So instead, they put a mask in between the two cages.
With this effect, the transmission reduction came down to 16%. 66 to 16%. Now, they simulated then wearing the mask the other way, such that the victims were wearing a mask. When they blew it this way, transmission rate was 25%. 66 to 25%, a drop, but it wasn't as good as if the infected hamsters were wearing. But if you think about it, if both sides, both the hamsters, the infected and uninfected, were both wearing, you would have synergism. We're talking about 1% risk of transmission. That's where we break the cycle for COVID-19 transmission. One other thing, those hamsters that fell sick with the mask protection were much milder than those hamsters that fell sick without the mask protection. It clearly illustrated one point. The more virus is transmitted, the greater the severity of the illness.
But the simple act of wearing a mask to fight off COVID-19 still divides the world today. To wear or not to wear? That is the democratic question. SARS-CoV-2 loves to travel. Its bucket list? The planet. But that doesn't mean it's welcome. And certainly not by the East, whose memories of SARS-1 and MERS are still very fresh.
In this case, many Asian governments adopted the recommendations from the medical experts, from pure science. They took on masks, they took on social distancing, and with that, we saw them come out of COVID-19, out of that pandemic at a much earlier stage. There is a phrase in Mandarin. In Chinese, it goes by 牺牲小我,完成大我, to sacrifice the small of me to accomplish the bigger in me, in this case, the country. With this understanding, every citizen is expected to put in that extra role, to wear the mask as and when we need to, because it's the right thing to do.
But SARS-CoV-2 still initiates a huge outbreak in workers' dormitories in Singapore, a reminder to the East not to get complacent. And then, it starts making plans for the West.
Think of me as the virus. I spread efficiently across many people, and anyone who's traveling, I will latch onto him. Not on the clothes where you can shed, but right into the respiratory tract where he can't get rid of. I will travel with him feeling well, confident. I'll travel in economy, I'll travel in business, I can travel in real class, first class suites. I don't need a passport immigration. I walk through because I am the Trojan horse. I can pass through all forms of security, including Secret Service, and I have records to prove it. I've hit the head of states, I hit United Kingdom Prime Minister, I've hit the President of the United States of America. I am impervious to nothing.
COVID-19. Welcome to the West.
In the Western culture, the individual wants, the individual respect plays a much bigger role. The idea that everyone has the right to exercise what they want, to respect all individuals, regardless of color, race, religion, even social standing or personal capabilities.
It's this freedom of choice that allows people in the West to follow their own beliefs, assess the risks, and make their own decisions about personal safety. And while they're doing all that, COVID will infect them anyway. Because unfortunately, what makes COVID-19 so dangerous is that nobody thinks it's dangerous.
And we have sad samples like from different nations. The teenager goes to party, drink, got home, no symptom, pass the virus to parents, and the parents die.
In the United States, millions have been infected. Over 300,000 Americans have died. In one of the most advanced countries on Earth, it's a real disease and people die. The problem is that not everyone has seen it. So until you've seen it or experienced it, you don't necessarily believe what you've heard.
I was pretty healthy. I didn't have diabetes, I didn't have heart conditions, and my blood pressure was normal. So in my mind, there was really no way that I would be sick with COVID. There I was, laying in bed with tubes attached and fighting for my life.
COVID-19 strikes very quickly. In fact, people could be talking to you at one moment, require oxygen the next day, and the third day, they would have a tube shoved down the throat.
COVID causes chaos in America, Spain, and the UK, turning people against their governments and each other. Discussions rage over the severity of the disease versus the economic fallout of trying to stop it. Quietly in the background, the biggest tragedy of COVID-19 is unfolding. The sheer infectiousness of SARS-CoV-2 has changed the way we die.
I think ultimately, death is the last act, and we want that to be good death. And we know from evidence a good death is when somebody's dying in their place of choice with the people who they want around them. And people have not had that.
Witnessing the loneliness of people during their last moments on Earth and not being able to do anything shocks even the hardiest healthcare professionals.
我的感慨是，我都是孩子啊，我们都是孩子啊，真不知道前面等着他们的是什么。
So of course I had read about the fact that family members aren't allowed in the ICU and that the only communication they have is through devices with either FaceTime or some other type of chat. And this was the first time that I actually watched it happen. So one of my colleagues called the patient's family and then stood over the patient's bed holding her phone up so that they could see her. And I listened to them try to say goodbye over the phone. I couldn't help but think about, if that were my mother, how awful that would be. To not be able to hold her hand. And to know that she was alone. Anyway, I just wish it didn't have to be like this. And I'm glad I haven't had to watch that 20 times or 40 times or however many times in the last few weeks, because clearly I'm not cut out for that.
It was the loneliest time I've ever experienced. I was cut off from the world. I thought about my siblings. In my mind, I was already saying goodbye to them. That I would watch over them And my heart started slowing down at that point, and I was okay. I was at peace.
I can't begin to appreciate or even tell you the new death process there is in this whole dying. Away from family, cut off from family, no contact, dying alone. I want to go in dignity. I want to go in the way I plan my death. But that is not granted because COVID takes the dignity of death from all of us.
Not only has COVID-19 destroyed a loving final farewell, it has turned the tragedy of death into a numbers game.
And I think, what's really interesting is to watch the response to these deaths. And, we see them being flicked up on the TV each day or on the radio. You hear so many people have died in the UK, the States, Brazil. And when you're hearing those numbers, it's really hard to understand what that means, that each one of those 155 deaths is a person with family, with a network, with a job, and they're suddenly gone, And I think that's been very, very difficult for people to understand. If we were describing it in the, we had 6 plane crashes over a course of a week, people would be so horrified.
As a doctor, each death is a tragedy. It's not a statistic.
Understanding the intricacies of why and how a virus kills people doesn't happen overnight, and for good reason.
The process of science itself is a slow, very rigorous process that involves having your data tested and challenged by other independent scientists in the field. And that's a very important part of the publication process. And of course, that doesn't work very well in a climate where people are screaming for answers.
But as global infections and death rates keep going up, science, in all its slow and methodical glory, unintentionally sends people on their own quest for answers.
I would say that the biggest one is that Bill Gates created COVID to control the whole world and have everyone injected with a microchip, get their data and control how they think. Like, okay, wow.
That and between that and the idea that 5G networks were spreading the virus, I don't know which one was that had less scientific basis.
Another alternative truth is that the virus was deliberately leaked from a lab in Wuhan to infect the world. Dr. Jerome Kim remembers a similar theory from the US back in the 80s.
In fact, there is an association, for instance, between a rumor that was started by the KGB, spread to an Indian newspaper about the HIV virus being invented by the US Army in order to kill people. People in Africa, African Americans, and actually eventually President Gorbachev, after he retired, wrote in his autobiography that this was a rumor that was planted. But by then it had spread. So I think that some of these conspiracy theories actually find their origin in disinformation campaigns that are being conducted by state actors.
SARS-CoV-2's ability to blur the lines between fact and fiction has been one of its greatest victories.
No longer, I as a healthcare worker who knows infectious diseases for the last 25 years, can I challenge an Instagrammer with 1 million followers who throws a tweet or a following on something that's ridiculous as all that fake news? This is a way of disrupting our own morale, our own soldiers. It will send chaos into the system, and that is the perfect recipe for the virus to spread.
To ease the uncertainty of whether you're going to catch the virus or not, it helps to know where the virus is and who else has got it.
So if you imagine that a pandemic, an epidemic in a society is like a forest fire, a positive case, is actually just the fire in front of you. And what you really want to know is, what is the fire doing not 100 feet from me, but a mile or 2 miles or 3 miles away from me? And the way you do that is with testing.
Finding the people who are infected is critical, because unless you can find them and quarantine them, they will keep spreading. Fortunately, humans love their mobile phones, and if there's one thing they are good at, it's creating phone apps.
I actually remember getting a text that said, we've detected an infection in your area in a person who came back from the United States. If you had been to the particular supermarket between 10 and 10:15, this person had been there. And so if you develop symptoms or think you might have been exposed, show this message and go for testing.
Which means every individual you find, you must immediately track those people around and lock them down. This will be put on quarantine. If at the end of the day, no one else falls sick in this group, you declare them free, you might even test them, show that they are negative, and they are returned back to community. That way, you control the virus one case at a time, one number at a time.
If there is one thing the human race can be thankful about, it is that SARS-CoV-2 doesn't seem to be a prolific mutator. At least, not yet.
So the amount of genetic variation in SARS-CoV-2 is 10 times less than influenza and thousands of times less than HIV.
SARS-CoV-2 is a conservative mutator, but as it infects more and more people, mutations will happen. What worries scientists is when it starts infecting not just people.
In all the outbreaks that I personally have been involved, we had never really worried about the risk of human to animal transmission, because like a hand nipple SARS, we control the viral infection among the human population very effectively. COVID-19 is different.
COVID-19 has not only infected humans, but animals, species that are just minding their own business.
And now we have evidence, at least 4 types of animals: cats, dogs, tigers in a zoo, and the worst is minks. Then what we created something, I call it an unnatural natural reservoir. Unnatural means that it's actually human passed to them. Natural means they're wildlife and they live their happy life, but now they carry this new virus.
By infecting animals, COVID not only creates a great mutation opportunity, it could make itself more deadly.
So basically, you create a new reservoir for COVID-19, and that in the future, the virus mutates, and that you can have SARS-CoV-3, SARS-CoV-4.
And like dengue and HIV have shown, the more strains of the virus you have, the harder it is to create a vaccine. The idea of vaccination has been around for centuries.
So back hundreds of years ago in China, smallpox was a very bad disease. 30% of the people who got smallpox died. But in China, they made an interesting discovery, and that is they would take the dried scars or scabs from a smallpox victim, and they would blow it into the nose of a person who hadn't been exposed. They get a mild case of it, and that mild case is sufficient to inoculate them, to give them protection against smallpox.
One of vaccination's greatest advocates was George Washington.
So the US Army, when we were fighting the Revolutionary War against England, was having problems with smallpox because, unlike Europe, the United States is relatively isolated. And if smallpox hit a US Army unit, a significant number of people would be put out of action, and a large number of them would die. So George Washington decided to use this variolation to protect the US Army against smallpox. And he was actually ordered by the Continental Congress not to do it, but he decided it was an imperative, and he did it anyway. So again, The combination of clear messaging, unified command and control, and support from the people is really critical.
Sunshine, sunshine.
COVID-19 continues its onslaught. This time, tormenting Brazil, India, and Russia on a huge scale. Meanwhile, the USA records more than 200,000 infections in one day. Never in recent history has such hope been pinned on a vaccine.
So we are kind of caught in a situation where we don't have the vaccine, we don't have treatment, and everything was left to us.
Fast-tracking a process that usually takes 5 to 10 years, a handful of companies announce that they have created vaccines that can reduce potential infections by as much as 95%. It's an extraordinary scientific milestone and a beacon of hope.
And that is a real victory for vaccination. So, there'll be lots of celebrating. We have a vaccine. It's shown to be safe and effective. But there's still going to be really important questions.
Each vaccine would have its own problems. The longevity, the administration, and whether you need repeated doses.
Who's going to make enough vaccine? 16 billion doses, high quality? How are you going to distribute it around the world? So I think that in the end, this virus has been able to always exploit our weakest point. We have to prepare. We have to anticipate what problems could potentially occur. Because really, until all of us are safe, none of us is safe.
When COVID took on the world, it succeeded where many other viruses before it failed. It got the world to take on itself.
COVID-19 taught me a lesson to say, as a scientist, we have to realize science has its limitations. We are in a society, science only contributes to certain paths. Then we have the culture, we have the politics, we have the diplomacy.
If all the generals were to listen to the medical experts well and good, we would win this battle easily.
But what science has taught us over the years is that the next time the same virus emerges, we will be ready. Hopefully not just for COVID-19, but for all future COVIDs.
我们人类和传染病的斗争始终是处于一个被动防御的阶段，历史上始终都是先有病，后想办法找病原体。那么我们能不能改变这种由被动变为一个主动防治的过程呢？这是我现在思考的一个重要问题。
What I think will be different, maybe memories will fade. I hope they don't. What I think will be different is people will have an appreciation of two things. First of all, that understanding viruses is important for humans generally. So real virology is something that we need to know about because it's one of our biggest existential threats out there. And the second thing I think people will have got, and I hope they'll keep it, is it's not all about individual choice and freedom. It's very much more about how societies respond, how we collectively respond. And if we can capture these two elements afterwards, that public health is important, not just private health care, and that viruses are important generally, then I think that we're in good shape.